that this is what you're looking at, and this is not what you, and because there are many different ideas about God, there are many different ideas about spirits, people are using words to describe their own experience, the words always fail. But then I find myself focusing on the human side, the thing that I can describe, the commonalities that I can describe. I'm always also, though, struggling with or aware of there's so much there that I cannot capture, see, or understand. And then, you're left with mystery.
Can I pick up on something you said? Mm-hmm. You talk about oblivion when anesthesia makes your brain go to sleep. But that's not quite the same thing as proof that the brain, therefore, is producing consciousness, because I've had the experience of a component of my radio breaking, and there's oblivion inside my radio. But the radio station and the transmission have not stopped. So is it, you seem to be advancing the idea of the brain produces consciousness, and as you were saying, I don't have a dog in this race. It could be that it's more like a radio, it tunes it in, and that it hasn't ceased just because one of the components has stopped. Would that count as a scientific view or just mumbo-jumbo?
No, so you have to ask so firstly, I think you're right in the sense that that is an alternative explanation for the oblivion that general anesthesia induces. I try to remain a little bit agnostic. I think the language that the brain produces consciousness is itself laden with all kinds of assumptions. It's almost dualistic in a sense. So the brain might produce it, it might be identical to it in some ways, or it might entail it. So I think that these are all kind of subtle distinctions. It's important to not fall into any one of them without realizing what you're doing. It's also possible that the brain is some kind of receiver for some consciousness that's happening. But that seems, again, a relatively unparsimonious explanation for why consciousness stops when the brain stops, because you have to then sort of explain how it's receiving consciousness, where else it is, what the mechanisms are that might lead to this phenomenon. And you have to try and make it testable somehow. So it's not impossible, but then what explanatory role is this playing too? Again, if I don't just turn the brain completely off, as in anesthesia, but just change part of it, stimulate part of it, damage part of it, our conscious experience changes in very predictable ways. Now, you could say it's a very complicated receiver inside here. So if you damage a little bit of it, you remove the ability for it to detect radio 4, but you can still tune into radio 5 live. But then you start, it starts to become a very strange kind of explanation where all of a sudden your receiver is as complicated as the whole system of radio broadcasting itself. And so what's the point of proposing something else?
Fair enough.
Well, to come back to a much more sort of practical level of normal vision, you see, taking your idea of controlled hallucinations, which you say are projected, what I can't understand is why the hallucination, being a hallucination, can't go through the skull. Why the skull is an insulating barrier that keeps the hallucination inside the head.
Well, so actually, this does bring up something you said about fields, and I think you're absolutely right to bring up the point of fields, because fields are non-local, and they do extend, and it is indeed true that neural activity generates electromagnetic fields, and this is the basis of a lot of our brain imaging methods. And these electromagnetic fields do extend beyond the skull, otherwise these imaging methods wouldn't work. But they are extremely, extremely weak. And this is why imaging doesn't work at a very long distance at all. So EM and electromagnetic fields do exist, but there is not a candidate other kind of field that we know of in physics that could do the kind of projection you're talking about. And nor do I think we need one, because I think it again comes back to our conversation. The property that our experiences seem to be out there in the world does not mean they actually are, but it is a phenomenological observation that deserves to be taken seriously, and philosophers since Hume have already done that. Evolutionarily, it would be very weird if our perceptual systems had evolved so that we experienced things to be in our minds rather than in the world. And this does sometimes happen in some kinds of visual hallucination. So it's no mystery at all to me that mechanism within the brain can create a perceptual experience that seems as if it is out there in the world. And that seeming as if is something that can change. In synesthesia, it's a condition where people have a mixing of the senses. They're often not perceived to be out there in the world. So it's something that can be manipulated in a way that tracks again to differences in the brain.
But one of the things that I think I'm hearing is that different kinds of methods, different ways of gathering data, change the way in which one relates to what one takes to be true. Because one of the things that I find is, and I think, Rupert, this is true for you, is that when I sit with people, if I don't allow myself, if I'm not able to be in a point of view in which I can recognize that it's possible for the universe to be far bigger than I might expect. People talk differently. People don't, and I actually hear what they say differently. I need to be in a position of ontological neutrality in order to hear clearly what the people that I'm talking to are trying to tell me. And then I'm dancing back and forth between, okay, what do I think is true? What I think is this person saying? But there somehow has to be this openness. And I think that's different from the kind of work that you do. And that's just kind of interesting.
One of the things in your work is you make the point, it's quite late on in your book, that how people think about their own mind changes who they are and what they are and how that mind works. Does that include the sort of the materialistic, reductionistic worldview? And if you think that your mind is just reducible to electrical currents, do you become a different kind of human being?
I've been wondering about that. So one of the things that I find so moving when people talk to me about beings that talk back is that I see a richness in their experience. I see an aliveness in their world. And there's a piece of me that envies some of the intense commitments of my evangelical Christians. The world somehow is, to be an evangelical Christian is to be committed to the view that you are happy. And sometimes I listen to this and I think, why are these people telling me that they're so happy? But then they also kind of look pretty happy. And so there's a way in which trying to manage, and I see people managing their own awareness of themselves. And I think there may be some truth to what you've said.
Well, I'd like to ask you, Tanya, when in your book, How God Becomes Real, you point out that for people who are religious in various different cultures, they have to do a lot of things to have these experiences, rituals, singing, prayers, and so on. Does the opposite apply for those for whom God becomes unreal? Because, as you point out, it's a historical anomaly. Modern Western post-Christian Europe and lots of North America, where a large number of people are secular, and if not atheist, agnostic at least, where God has become unreal, which is very unusual in the whole history of humanity. Do you think that requires a conscious effort? I mean, for example, to maintain a materialist belief, usually for materialists I know, involves filtering out all experiences of the sense of being stared at. It's just a coincidence. Telepathy, oh, you just remember when you're right, you forget when you're wrong, that's a coincidence too. It involves quite a lot of effort denying phenomena which occur in their lives and avoiding things that would make God more real.
So I have a colleague, Justin Barrett, who makes exactly that argument. He says, look, in the course of world history and the diversity of societies that we know of, there's such a tiny number of people who are truly atheists. There are lots of semi-believers over the course of, I think people always mark supernatural, spiritual things as different in kind, epistemically different in kind than tables and chairs. But I think that it's relatively unusual to have people who have very particularly materialistic beliefs. So I think you can make that argument. What I also see is that people who developed a very intimate relationship with an invisible being, particularly when that invisible being is very, very powerful and they decide they don't believe in that being anymore, that can be devastating. It can be really hard, so that particularly if somebody is the kind of Christian in which they grew up in a church in which that church, they grow up in a kind of church in which they feel that their God has a particular view about their sexuality or about their political beliefs, and they decide that those are wrong beliefs. They disagree with their God. It can feel for a while as if they're being suffocated from within. It's so hard to manage that people talk about the need to deconstruct their life and reconstruct their sense of who they are.
It's almost, I mean, most things in technology have like a dual use, right? So it's almost as if religion is a dual use social technology. It can provide people with a lot of comfort and enchantment and enrichment, but of course it can go the other way too.
Absolutely. That's why you have to be, in effect, I am very impressed by when people choose a God that works for them, how amazing that can be for them. I also see that people can be unlucky in what creeps into their concept of God and the kinds of rules that God expects them to follow.
Is there a difference between truth, with a capital T, which science in the West tends to feel that it owns the way to truth, and things that are important? What I'm thinking of is, if you took the view that you should only believe those things that are true, and that's what, then you would have to say, well, don't read Shakespeare, because none of it is true. But would it be important to read things which aren't true, but have an importance? And it's sort of, in other words, do we impoverish ourselves by saying we should really just concentrate on the things which we can prove to be objectively true?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, I think there's been a long rolling discussion in philosophy about whether you can derive ought from is, whether knowing what is the case can motivate moral principles, and this just rumbles on and on as to whether it's demonstrable or not. But I think in practice, science and a scientific worldview, which isn't, by the way, it isn't purely reductionistic. I think there's just as a slight sidebar, it's important to distinguish the general scientific commitment that things are explicable, that causes basically run down. You're not imputing weird stuff that suddenly appears at different levels. Ultimately, it's all quarks in the void, or whatever our fundamental level might be. And a more methodological, broader perspective, which is that, okay, if I want to explain human psychology, I'm not going to do it in terms of individual quarks. I'm going to do it at at the level of psychological constructs, and perhaps the adjacent levels, neurons on one side, other people at the other. And emergence in this sense, I think, is real and true. We can talk about different levels, that's fine. So reductionism often gets a bit of a bad rap, I think unnecessarily so. But yes, I think what we find out about the nature of the world in terms of well-justified beliefs, in terms of evidence, can inform what is important and what is not important. But it doesn't exhaustively describe that realm. I mean, your example of Shakespeare makes the point very well. Of course, reading literature, even though it's not objectively true, is of course important and useful because and demonstrably so, because it can shape our understanding of how people act and behave and lead to a better world in that way.
So there can be things which are important for us, which aren't true, but that's not the point. We shouldn't get sidetracked saying, well, was Macbeth truly the way that Shakespeare wrote him? And so some things, as I said, they're important, not necessarily true. But is that enough for you, Rupert? Because I suspect for someone to say, well, look, yes, what you're talking about are things that are important, but, and then in parentheses, but they're probably not true, but let's not talk about that. I think you think they are also true in this more objective sense. Is that right?
Well, I think that the extended mind, I think things like the sense of being stared at are true. I think they happen.
Not
Most
just
people
important,
think
but
they
true.
happen.
Not just important, but true.
True.
Okay.
And I think that other forms of the extended mind, which are taboo from the point of view of materialism, like telepathy, which most people have experienced, about 85% of people have had the experience of thinking of someone who then rings on the phone and they say, funny, I was just thinking about you, or know who it is when they call. I've done a lot of research on this. It's not just coincidence, it's not just forgetting when you're wrong. You can do controlled experiments, you have 4 callers, you pick the caller at random, the experimenter picks the caller at random, they call the subject who's being filmed, and they have to guess before they pick up the phone who's calling, and they're right much more than chance. It's been replicated and so on. I think that's true. I think the evidence is quite strong that our minds extend through attention, which literally means stretching towards, ad tendere, and intention, into the world and affect others at a distance. That's one reason I think that it's not just a construct or a way of thinking of how things are happening inside the head, not just limited to the brain. I think it's also the case that consciousness, I don't know if this is true or not, but the idea that consciousness is confined to brains is an assumption as well. I call it the cerebrocentric view of consciousness. It only exists in, the whole universe is unconscious, according to the normal materialist view. Galaxies, stars, the whole planets, the whole thing's unconscious, except for human brains on this planet where it's emerged, and possibly animal brains as well. That consciousness is somehow confined to this very tiny part of the universe. We happen to be lucky enough to be part where it is. The alternative view is a panpsychist view that there's levels of consciousness even in atoms and molecules. And I would say not just in atoms and molecules and animals and plants, but in the sun, in the galaxy, in the whole galactic system, and maybe the whole cosmos. Consciousness may not be confined to brains at all. And our whole discussion so far has really been revolving around the idea that, well, not the whole discussion, but a lot of it, that it's all about the brain.
Well, I was relying on you to get to pan-consciousness.
Well, so I think, you know, there is a serious debate within philosophy and science at the moment about panpsychism. Part of it is motivated by the hard problem, because some conservative materialists, who radically conservative, let's say, think, well, you can dissolve the hard problem not by lots of research on the brain, as Anil believes, but just by saying, well, a little bit of consciousness in an electron, a little bit more in an atom, a bit more in a molecule. And so by the time you get to the brain, it's a difference of degree, not of kind. And once they've got to the human brain, they stop, because they've solved the hard problem by attributing tiny bits of consciousness to atoms. I myself think that if you're going to argue that kind of way, why stop at the brain? Which is why I wrote a paper called Is the Sun Conscious?, published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, exploring the idea that the sun may be conscious, and the interface between its activity and its consciousness may be its electromagnetic field, and the sun may indeed have actions it controls consciously. The whole galaxy might be conscious, and the different solar systems within it may be like cells in the body of the galaxy, of a greater consciousness. There may be many levels of consciousness in the universe. And so therefore it's not all about the brain. And no, I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems to me very plausible, and it also fits with many traditional views of nature. So I take seriously the idea of panpsychism without necessarily believing it's true, whereas I do think telepathy and the sense of being stared at are probably true.
Tanya, you wanted to...
So what I'm struck by is that I'm not sure, I don't know where I sit on the belief that the sun is conscious, but I do think that it is an ethically more effective way to be in the world, to treat the entire world as alive. And so one of the arguments that's emerging out of my field is that if humans did accept a more animistic, panpsychic vision of the world as being alive, we wouldn't have gotten ourselves into the mess of climate change in the first place. We would have had more respect for the earth.
Yeah, this is kind of interesting, whether it's back to your point about this, whether this distinction between truth and importance. And it is kind of tricky if there are some things that we kind of know to be not true.